Hey guys, tonight we're going to a village, a small one, a few hundred people, maybe a little more. In the English countryside, somewhere in the Midlands or the rural south, the kind of place that has a church that is older than anyone living can remember the building of, a pub that has had the same name for 200 years and probably 4 different sets of walls, a post office that is also the general shop, a blacksmith, a schoolhouse, and a main street that is wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other if both drivers are paying attention. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more of this coming. Alright, let's start before dawn. The waking. It is 4:30 in the morning and you are awake. Not because an alarm has gone off. There is no alarm clock in your cottage. There is no clock of any kind. Or rather, there is one. A battered thing on the mantelpiece that your father wound on Sundays, and that runs fast in summer and slow in winter, that you use for reference rather than reliance. You are awake because your body knows what time it is. Because you have been waking at this hour for as long as you can remember, because your mother woke at this hour, because the agricultural rhythm of the year that dictates the day's work begins its pull on you long before your eyes open, a kind of biological appointment that you have been keeping all your life. The room you wake in is small. If you are a farm labourer, which most of the men in this village are in one form or another, your cottage has 2 rooms downstairs, and if you are fortunate, a second floor that has been divided into sleeping spaces under the slope of the thatch. The walls are stone or brick, or in older cottages cob, a mixture of clay and straw and sometimes animal hair, and they are thick enough to keep out some of the cold, though not all of it. The windows are small for the same reason, and they are not sealed with the double-glazed efficiency of modern windows. Cold air moves through the gaps in the frames in winter with a persistence that the blankets on the bed manage imperfectly. You sleep with your spouse. If you have children, they sleep in the same room in most cottages, or in the same bed if the room is too small for separate arrangements. Privacy, in the modern sense, is simply not a feature of this life. The bodies of the people you love are present at close range through most of the hours of the day and all of the hours of the night, and this proximity, which would strike a modern person as intolerable, is simply the texture of existence, as natural and as unremarkable as breathing. The fire in the kitchen fireplace, the room below you, which is the heart of the cottage in every sense, has been banked overnight. Not fully extinguished, because relighting a dead fire requires effort that a living fire, carefully managed, never requires. There is a skill to banking a fire, to finding exactly the arrangement of coals and ash that will keep a core of warmth alive through the dark hours without consuming the fuel needed for the morning's work. Your mother had the skill. You have inherited it. It is one of those knowledges that lives in the hands rather than the head, performed without thinking, as automatic as breathing. You go downstairs. The kitchen is cold in the specific way that the cold collects in low, stone-floored spaces overnight. Not the dry cold of the bedroom, but a damp, settled cold that the stone holds and releases slowly. You unbank the fire. You add wood. The stack beside the fireplace, which needs replenishing and which you will add to the list of things to attend to before the week is out. The fire catches, slowly at first, then with purpose, and the kitchen begins to warm in the irregular, generous way that an open fireplace warms, intensely at close range, diminishingly toward the walls and corners, creating a geography of warmth in the room that everyone in the household navigates instinctively, learning from childhood which chair to take and which to avoid. The water for the morning comes from the well, or from the pump if the village is modern enough to have a communal pump, or from the stream that runs along the eastern edge of the common if neither is convenient. You carry it in a bucket or in a pitcher if the distance is short. The water is cold. It is not treated, not chlorinated, not filtered through any modern municipal process. It is what it is, groundwater, stream water, the water that has been here before the village was built and will be here after it is gone. In summer it is clear and cold and tastes of mineral and green. In winter it can freeze at the surface of the well overnight, requiring the ice to be broken before the bucket can be lowered. In spring, when the thaw runs through the clay fields, it can turn cloudy with suspended soil, And in these periods, the experienced householder lets it settle in a jug before using it, a practical measure learned from observation and not from any understanding of what is in the water that makes it sometimes safe and sometimes not. What is in the water is something the year 1875 does not fully understand yet, though the groundwork for understanding it has been laid. Germ theory is new. The connection between contaminated water and specific diseases, cholera, typhoid, the dysenteries that kill children in wet years, has been established by John Snow's work in the 1850s and by Pasteur's in the following decade, but the knowledge is still making its way from the scientists who produced it to the ordinary people who need it most. In 1875, in this village, the water is used because the water is what there is, and most people most of the time do not get sick from it, and when they do, the connection is not always made, and the water continues to be used. 5:30. The kitchen. By 5:30, the fire is going properly, and the kitchen has crossed from cold to cool on its way to warm. The kitchen in your cottage is not a room that would be recognizable to a modern person as a kitchen in any except the most functional sense. There is no running water. All water that enters this room is carried in. There is no gas or electricity. There is the fire and the things that can be done with fire. An iron pot that hangs from a crane above the hearth, capable of being swung over the fire or away from it as needed. A griddle for flatbreads and drop scones. A Dutch oven, an iron pot with a recessed lid on which coals can be piled, approximating the even heat of a proper oven in a room that does not have one. Some cottages have access to a communal bread oven, a large masonry structure typically located near the bakehouse or in a central village location, heated with a wood fire that is allowed to burn down, the coals raked out, and the bread put in to bake in the retained heat. The communal oven is used on specific days, by arrangement, and the social organization of the baking schedule is a minor but real piece of the village's social infrastructure. Breakfast, in a farm labourer's cottage, is not an elaborate meal. Porridge, in cold months, oats or barley meal, boiled in water with perhaps a scraping of salt, eaten hot and filling, the specific warmth of porridge on a cold morning being one of the most uncomplicated physical comforts available in this life. Bread, if there is bread left from yesterday's baking. Perhaps an egg, if the hens are laying well, fried in the pan over the fire in the fat from whatever was cooked last. The fat matters. Every bit of fat that comes from cooking, from bacon, from lard, from the occasional small piece of meat, is saved. The dripping jar is a permanent fixture of the working-class Victorian kitchen, and what goes into it and what comes out of it is a small but real measure of the household's economic situation. A well-stocked dripping jar means that recent meals have included some fat, which means some access to meat or to the lard that can be bought when finances allow. A depleted dripping jar means recent meals have been plainer, and the frying and the flavour that fat provides will be absent for a while. You eat quickly. There is not much time. The day's work does not wait on the household's breakfast schedule. 6 o'clock. The walk to the fields. By 6 o'clock, or by first light in summer, which comes considerably earlier, the farm labourers of the village are moving. You are among them. You join the men from the nearby cottages who are heading in the same direction, toward the farm where you are employed, and the walk to the fields is done in a group, because most of you live within a short walking distance of where you work, and the paths from the cottages to the farms run together in the same direction for most of the way. The path takes you past the church. The church in this village is old, medieval old, pre-Reformation. Built of the local stone in the perpendicular style that characterises the parish churches of this part of England. It has been modified over the centuries, extended, altered, fitted with Victorian pews of pine to replace the older and more varied seating of earlier periods. Its walls washed with lime over whatever medieval paintings might have been there before the Reformation required their removal. It sits at the centre of the village physically and socially, in a way that is still true in 1875, though it is less true than it was a generation ago, and less true every year as the population grows and the alternatives multiply. The fields you walk to are organised under the enclosure system that has been transforming English agriculture since the 18th century. Where earlier centuries had seen the common fields of the medieval open field system, strips of land farmed by different households, interleaved across a shared landscape, the enclosure movement has replaced most of this with privately bounded fields, each belonging to a specific owner, with hedgerows or stone walls marking the boundaries. The English hedgerow landscape that is now considered quintessentially rural and beautiful is, in large part, a creation of the 18th and 19th centuries, the physical mark of enclosure. The enclosure system has been good for agricultural productivity and very bad for the rural poor. The common rights that gave cottagers access to shared land for grazing, for fuel, for gathering, rights that were ancient, customary and unwritten, and which had made life marginally more sustainable for people at the economic margin, have been extinguished by enclosure. The cottager who once kept a pig on the common or grazed a few geese on the village green now has no access to that land. The pig and the geese are gone, or must be kept on the tiny plot of the cottage garden, or not at all. The farm you work for is substantial, several hundred acres probably, belonging to a farmer who is not aristocracy but is respectable rural middle class, a man who employs a number of permanent hands and takes on additional labour at peak times, who has a farmhouse that is large enough to have a parlour he rarely uses, who attends the same church as you on Sunday and sits in a pew that is formally better than yours, whose wife does not work in the fields or in anyone else's house. 7 o'clock. The day's work begins. The work of a farm labourer in 1875 is physically demanding in ways that modern people, who work in service economies and sit at desks and drive vehicles, have genuinely lost the bodily knowledge of. It is not simply hard in the sense of tiring. It is hard in the sense of requiring the full sustained capacity of an adult human body, applied continuously for most of the daylight hours, at tasks that are resistant, heavy, repetitive and conducted in weather that does not accommodate itself to the worker's preferences. The specific work varies enormously with the season, and the agricultural calendar is the organising framework of the entire village's year, so we are going to follow it through a full seasonal cycle, beginning with this morning. If it is spring, the late March or April of 1875, the work of the morning is almost certainly preparation of the fields for planting. Ploughing, if the ploughing is not yet done, the work of turning the soil with horse-drawn ploughs, walking behind the horse for hours, keeping the plough steady and the furrows straight, a skill that looks simple from a distance and requires considerable expertise to do correctly. The furrow must be turned to a consistent depth, the soil broken adequately without being pulverized, the line maintained with sufficient precision that the field, when done, is properly prepared for seed. The ploughman's relationship with his horses is a genuine working relationship, developed over time, specific to these particular animals. A good farm horse is a large, powerful, and sometimes opinionated animal, trained to respond to voice commands and to the signals transmitted through the plough harness, and working with one requires the same kind of embodied understanding that the mahout had with his elephant, the understanding that lives in the body rather than the mind, the knowledge of when to push and when to yield and when to stop and simply wait for the animal to settle. If it is summer, the June or July that brings the longest days and the heaviest labour, the work is haymaking, or later, harvest. Haymaking is the cutting and drying and collecting of the grass crop that will feed the livestock through the winter, and it is intensely time-sensitive because it requires dry weather, and a failure of weather at the wrong moment can mean the loss of the crop, which means insufficient winter feed, which means livestock losses, which means economic losses that the household cannot easily absorb. Harvest, the cutting of the grain crop, is the peak labour demand of the entire agricultural year. More workers are needed for harvest than for any other task, and the farms take on additional hands at harvest time, including women and older children who do not do the heaviest labour during the rest of the year. The specific technology of harvest in 1875 is transitional. The scythe and the reaping hook have been the primary harvest tools for centuries, and they still dominate in many operations. But the mechanical reaper, invented by Cyrus McCormick in the 1830s and refined through subsequent decades, is becoming increasingly common on larger farms. The mechanical reaper can cut in a day what would take many men a week. For the men who would have been employed at those weeks' worth of cutting, the mechanical reaper is a machine that takes their work. The agricultural labour market of the 1870s is under pressure from mechanisation in exactly this way. Each new piece of farm equipment that performs work previously done by hand is, from the perspective of agricultural productivity, an improvement, and from the perspective of the agricultural labourer, a threat. The wages of farm labourers across this period are not rising in proportion to the improvements in what they produce. The gains of agricultural improvement largely accrue to the farmers and the landowners, while the labourers' share remains nearly static. This is not a secret. It is a widely discussed, widely felt reality of rural life in the 1870s, discussed in the cottages and in the pub and in the political meetings that have been growing in number and in seriousness as the decade progresses. Joseph Arch founded the National Agricultural Labourers Union in 1872, 3 years before the day we're spending in this village, and though the union has faced fierce resistance from farmers and landowners, it represents the first serious organised attempt by agricultural workers to address the structural inequality of their position. Whether you are a member, or have heard a speaker, or have opinions about the union that you share in the right company and keep quiet in the wrong company, depends on your specific situation and your specific village. But the union exists, and the conversation exists, and the day's work is done against a backdrop of economic and political awareness that the romanticised version of the Victorian village consistently underplays. 8 o'clock in the morning, the village waking. While the farm labourers are already in the fields, the rest of the village is waking into its own routines. The vicar is at morning prayers, in the church, attended by whatever proportion of the village attends morning prayers in 1875, which is probably a smaller proportion than would have attended 30 years earlier and a larger proportion than will attend 30 years hence. The Victorian church is experiencing, through this period, a slow but real erosion of its near-universal hold on rural social life, as education spreads and as the nonconformist chapels, Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, provide alternative sites of community for the portions of the village that have shifted their allegiances. The schoolhouse is filling. The Education Act of 1870 has made elementary education compulsory in England and Wales, which means that the children of this village are now, in principle, required to attend school. In practice, the enforcement of attendance is imperfect. There is a school board attendance officer, but his jurisdiction and his time are both limited, and at peak agricultural periods the pull of children's labour is sometimes stronger than the pull of the schoolroom. But the proportion of children receiving some formal education is significantly higher in 1875 than it was in 1850, and the village school is a genuine presence in the community. The schoolteacher is almost certainly a woman, probably young, possibly recently trained at one of the teacher training colleges that have been established specifically to produce the supply of teachers that the 1870 Act requires. She is paid a salary that is inadequate by almost any measure, but that represents, in the context of the options available to educated women without capital in 1875, one of the more respectable forms of independent employment available. She may board with a family in the village. She is an educated person in a community where formal education is still not universal, which gives her a specific kind of social standing that is distinct from both the working-class village and the middle-class professional world. The children arriving at the school range in age from 5 to 12 or so, though the upper age is fluid. Children who are needed at home or on the farm may stop attending long before the theoretical leaving age, and the school board attendance officer's records for this period show the contested, negotiated reality of compulsory education in a community where children's labour has economic value that the law is imperfectly positioned to override. The classroom is a single room, or at most two, with different age groups receiving different levels of instruction in the same space. The teaching method is the monitorial system or something close to it. Older, more advanced students assisting in the instruction of younger ones under the overall direction of the teacher. The curriculum is the 3 R's, reading, writing and arithmetic, with the addition of religious instruction, which is mandatory under the educational legislation, and in practice usually means learning the catechism, memorizing scripture and absorbing a basic framework of Christian moral values that is assumed to be as fundamental as literacy. The children recite. They copy letters, then words, then sentences, on slates, the individual blackboards that each child carries, washed and reused, because paper in quantities sufficient for routine educational use is still an expense that many village schools manage carefully. The scratch and squeak of slate pencils on slates is the soundtrack of the Victorian village school, a sound that an entire generation of English children knew and that disappeared almost completely within the following few decades as paper became cheap and slates were retired. 9 o'clock, the blacksmith. Down the main street, past the post office and the general shop and the cottages whose front gardens are at this season either bare or coming into spring colour depending on the week, there is the blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith is one of the most essential people in this village, in a way that requires some explanation for a modern audience that encounters blacksmiths primarily in historical reenactments and decorative ironwork demonstrations. In 1875, almost everything in this village that is made of iron was either made by this man or repaired by him. The horseshoes on every working horse in the village, the hinges on the farmhouse doors, the tools, the scythes and sickles and hoes and spades that the agricultural work is done with, the nails, the latches, the brackets, the wheel rims on the farm carts, iron hoops that the blacksmith heats and fits to the wooden wheel and then quenches rapidly so the iron contracts and grips the wood, the kitchen ranges that the wealthier households have installed, the chains, the hooks. The blacksmith's forge is hot, always, and dark, the darkness broken by the red and yellow light of the fire that heats the iron to working temperature. The specific skill of reading iron, knowing by its colour whether it is hot enough to work, knowing how much force to apply and in what direction to shape it toward the desired form, knowing when to reheat and when to quench and when to leave it and when to push it. This is a skill that takes years to develop and that, once developed, gives a competent blacksmith a kind of authority in the village that is not social in the ordinary sense but is practical. When your horse throws a shoe 6 miles from the nearest alternative, the blacksmith is the most important person you know. The smithy is a social space as well as a working one. People stop in, men, mostly, dropping by on their way somewhere or from somewhere, exchanging news, the specific ambient information exchange that constitutes the village's substitute for any kind of formal news medium. The blacksmith hears a great deal. He is stationary. The village comes to him. He knows who has had a run of bad luck, and whose harvest was good, and whose cow is in calf, and what the farmer up the lane said to the miller about the state of the roads last Thursday. He doesn't broadcast this information indiscriminately. There is a social code around what is said to whom and in what context. But he is, in the flow of the village's information, one of the more central nodes. The forge is also one of the few genuinely warm places in the village in winter, and this is not a trivial consideration. The cold of a Midlands winter in 1875, in the uninsulated cottages of agricultural labourers, is a chronic and significant physical reality, and any place that is reliably warm attracts people for that reason alone. 10 o'clock. The women's work. Let's step back now to the cottages, because the work that happens there is as important as the work that happens in the fields. And it is work that is consistently underrepresented in the accounts of Victorian rural life that were written down by the people who were accustomed to writing things down, who were usually not the women doing it. The women of the agricultural labouring class in a village like this one are working harder, in most measurable respects, than the men, not because their work is more physically demanding, though some of it is, but because it does not stop. The farm labourer has defined working hours more or less. He is at work when the farm requires him, and he is, in the evenings and on Sundays, not at work. The farmer's wife, the farm labourer's wife, the women of the village, their work is the continuous, daily, never fully completed work of maintaining the household, and it begins before the farm labourer's day starts and ends after it finishes, and the idea of a day off, in the sense that the man's Sunday might approximate a day off, is not available to them in the same way. The morning's work in a cottage kitchen in 1875 is substantial. The fire must be maintained throughout the day at a level sufficient for the cooking that needs to happen. The bread must be made. This is typically a twice-weekly task, baking enough to last several days, and in households where bread is the primary food, The quality and quantity of the bread has direct consequences for the family's nourishment. The dough must be mixed and kneaded, a physically demanding process done by hand without the stand mixers or food processors of later generations, requiring sustained effort in the specific way that kneading requires. While the bread rises and then bakes, there is the cleaning. The cottage floor is stone or brick, or in older cottages simply beaten earth, swept daily, scrubbed on the dedicated cleaning day of the week. The fireplace is cleaned, the ash removed, the grate or the hearthstone cleared, the tools cleaned and replaced. The windows, small as they are wiped, the surfaces wiped. The dishes from breakfast washed in water that was heated over the fire. The laundry, when it falls, is the heaviest single domestic task of the week, and it falls usually on Mondays in the established custom of the period. The clothes of a family of 4 or 6, plus the linen, plus the work clothes that have been through a week of farm labour, represent a considerable volume of fabric, all of which must be heated in water, scrubbed on a washboard, wrung by hand, and hung to dry in whatever space and weather are available. The wringing alone, the sustained, repetitive effort of squeezing water from heavy, wet fabric, is the kind of physical work that leaves the hands red and aching by the end of the morning. And on wash day, there is frequently very little besides the laundry that gets done, because the laundry takes most of the available time and most of the available energy. But alongside all of this, the women of the village are also, many of them, doing economic work that supplements the household income in whatever way is available to them. Taking in laundry from other households, sewing, making shirts or other garments for sale or by commission, keeping hens and selling eggs, keeping a kitchen garden and selling the surplus, providing childcare for other families, selling dairy products if they have a cow or goats. The cash income available to an agricultural labourer's family from the man's wages alone is, in 1875, frequently not sufficient to fully cover the household's needs, and the women's supplementary income is not supplementary in the sense of being extra by. It is structural, built into the household's survival calculation. Noon, the dinner hour. At noon, or close to it, work stops for dinner, not lunch, dinner. The midday meal in working-class Victorian England is dinner, the main hot meal of the day, the one that the household has been working toward since morning. Tea is the evening meal, a lighter affair. Supper is a word used for something light before bed, if anything at all. The terminology maps onto a pattern of eating that is organised entirely differently from the modern middle-class eating schedule that has gradually become the norm. The farm labourer's midday dinner may be brought to him in the field, or he may walk back to the cottage, depending on the distance and the time of year. In summer, when the days are long and the fields are close, the walk back is practical. In winter, when every minute of daylight is needed for work and the cottage may be some distance away, the dinner is brought, often by a child, carrying a covered pot wrapped in cloth to retain the heat. What is in the pot depends entirely on the household's resources, the season, and the day of the week. The staples are bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetable the kitchen garden provides. Bacon, cured pork, appears more reliably than any other meat source because most cottages that have any garden space at all keep a pig or share a pig with a neighbour, and the cured pork from the autumn pig killing provides a regular background of animal protein and fat through the year. Fresh meat other than pork is uncommon, unless the household is managing the occasional rabbit from the hedgerow or the occasional fish from the stream. The vegetables from the kitchen garden are crucial. The kitchen garden of a Victorian cottage is not an ornamental space. It is worked ground, growing potatoes in the main, but also cabbages, onions, turnips, parsnips, beans, peas when the season allows, whatever the soil and the available effort can produce. The success of the kitchen garden is a genuine determinant of the household's quality of life through the year, and the women who tend them bring to the task the same accumulated knowledge that the farm labourers bring to the fields. Knowledge of soil, of seasons, of varieties, of what works in this specific place and what doesn't. Knowledge that has been accumulated through generations, and that is worth more than any gardening book. The afternoon tea that is brought out to the fields around 3 o'clock is not the tea of the imagination, the cakes and sandwiches of the middle-class Victorian ceremonial tea. It is bread, probably, and strong sweet tea in a can. The sugar providing energy for the afternoon's remaining work. The tea providing warmth in cold months and a break in all months. A few minutes of sitting and not working that are legitimately restorative in the way that sustained breaks from physical labour are restorative for both the body and the mind. 2 o'clock. The village's middle classes. The village is not only its farm labourers, it has its own middle class, small but real, and the lives of these people run through the day on a different track from the farm labouring majority. The farmer himself, the man who employs several of the village's labourers, is a figure of relative prosperity and local significance. His farmhouse sits back from the main road, substantial, with a parlour that is kept for occasions and a kitchen that is the house's real centre of life, with a wife who manages the household and possibly a servant girl from the village to assist her, with children who attend the school but who will be directed towards something better than agricultural labour for their futures. The farmer's day involves the management of the farm rather than its direct physical labour, though the line is not absolute. He is out in the fields, he knows the work, he has done it and continues to do aspects of it. But his role is increasingly supervisory as the farm grows, and the paperwork of the farm, the accounts, the records, the correspondence with suppliers and markets, takes a portion of his day that the labourers he employs never have to concern themselves with. The vicar is another village middle-class figure, and his position is more complex than it might appear. The Victorian country vicar is not simply a religious professional. He is, in many villages, the most educated person present, the person who writes letters for those who cannot write, who intercedes with authority on behalf of those who lack the connections to do it themselves, who manages the school and the church and the various charitable enterprises that the village depends on and that the church organises. His income varies enormously by parish. Some livings are comfortable, some are genuinely poor, but his social position is that of a gentleman, and the social rituals of the village reflect this in the deference shown to him in the street and the specific quality of attention that the more prosperous village households bring to their Sunday church attendance. The doctor, if the village is large enough to have one, or the doctor who covers the village as part of a larger rural practice, occupies a different kind of authority. The authority of someone who knows things that can save your life, in a world where the things that can save your life are not yet as numerous as they will become. Medicine in 1875 is in a transitional state. Germ theory is new. Anesthesia has been available for surgical procedures since the 1840s. The great public health reforms that have been improving urban survival rates are producing results, but the specific medical tools for treating most of the diseases that kill people in 1875 are not yet available. The doctor can set bones, can manage wounds with increasing success as antiseptic practice spreads from Lister's work, can manage some chronic conditions with some effectiveness, and can provide comfort and company in situations that are not medically amenable to treatment. This last is not a trivial contribution. Being attended to by a physician, being told what is happening in the body and what is likely to happen next, is a genuine service even when the outcome cannot be changed. The general shop, the post office and shop combined in most small villages, is the village's connection to the wider commercial world. Here, goods that the village cannot produce itself, tea, sugar, salt, tobacco, manufactured cloth, matches, candles, the basic manufactured goods of the Victorian consumer economy, are available for purchase. The shopkeeper is a figure of some importance because access to these goods is mediated through them, and the extension of credit, which most village shops do to most of their regular customers, creates an ongoing financial relationship that has social dimensions as well as commercial ones. The shopkeeper knows what you buy. They know when you are struggling because the credit account tells them, and they know when you are better off because the purchases change. This information is not shared casually. The village shopkeeper who gossips indiscriminately about customers' financial situations is a shopkeeper who loses customers, but it is held, and its presence in the relationship gives the shopkeeper a particular kind of knowledge about the village's actual, as opposed to apparent, economic life. 4 o'clock. The school day ends. At 4 o'clock, the children are released from school. They do not go home immediately in the way that modern children are typically retrieved and delivered back to the domestic space. They go into the street, into the common areas, into the fields and hedgerows, and wherever the village's topography provides the specific kind of space that children colonize for their own purposes. Spaces that adults use for other things, but that children, during the hours available to them, repurpose for their own social and imaginative life. The games played by Victorian village children would be mostly recognizable to a modern eye, because the games that children invent and reinvent across centuries are anchored in the same basic elements: running, chasing, the coordination of bodies in space, the negotiation of simple rules, and the disputes that arise when those rules are applied imperfectly. Tag in its various forms, marbles, spinning tops, hoop rolling, skipping games with ropes held by two children and turned in patterns that the skipper has to navigate, with their own elaborate vocabulary of rhymes and challenges. But the rural children of 1875 also have access to something that the urban children of the same period often do not: genuine outdoor space, unstructured, unwatched, where children can go further and stay longer than the supervised recreational spaces of later generations allow. The fields and lanes and woods around the village are navigated by these children with the same familiarity that their parents navigate the workspaces. Knowledge accumulated through years of play, specific knowledge of this hedge and this stream and this particular tree that can be climbed reliably and which ones cannot. Knowledge of where the mushrooms grow in autumn and where the nesting birds are in spring. This freedom has a shadow. Children's accidents are more common and more serious in their consequences, in a world without emergency medical services and without the safety infrastructure that modern playgrounds and supervised spaces provide. Falls from heights, drowning in the stream, encounters with agricultural machinery. These are the dangers that the rural childhood of 1875 contains, alongside its genuine pleasures. The children who are not in school, who have been kept back for farm work, or who have aged out of the school's effective reach, are working, and their work is real, though it is calibrated to their size and their strength. Bird scaring, walking the newly sown fields and making noise to keep the birds off, a job done by very young children, solitary and monotonous, paid in pennies if paid at all. Gleaning, following the harvest to gather the grain that the machinery or the reapers have missed, a right that the village poor have traditionally claimed, and that the mechanization of harvest is slowly eroding as machines leave less behind. Hop picking, stone picking, turnip thinning, the miscellaneous agricultural tasks that can be performed by small hands and that have, over centuries, been understood as children's work. 5 o'clock, the return from the fields. Around 5, in summer, or as the light fails in winter, the farm labourers return. The return from the fields has a quality that is different from the morning walk out. The morning has a kind of alertness to it. The day's work is ahead. The mind is calculating what needs to be done and in what order. The body is fresh enough to respond to the demands that the day will make. The return is different. The work has been done. The body has given what it has to give, and the specific quality of exhaustion that sustained physical labour produces, not the frantic tiredness of anxiety or the hollow tiredness of poor sleep, but the deep, grounded through the body tiredness of having worked. This is present in every step of the walk home. The men walk in groups in the morning because the work draws them together. They walk in smaller groups or alone in the evening because the work has distributed them across the farm's spaces and the returning paths are less unified. But the pub catches them on the way, or close enough to the way, and this is worth understanding. The pub is not, in this village, a peripheral or disreputable institution. It is a central one. In the most literal sense, it is often the physical centre of the village, and in the social sense, it is the primary formal gathering place for the men of the working and farming classes who form the majority of the village. The ale served there is good ale, the local brewer supplying something considerably better than what the cottagers can make at home, and the warmth of the pub, real warmth, from a proper fire in a proper hearth, in an establishment that can afford to maintain it, is genuinely appealing at the end of a working day. What happens in the pub is what has always happened in pubs. Drink is consumed, conversation is had, news is exchanged, arguments are had and sometimes concluded. The social bonds of the male community are maintained through the specific lubricant of shared presence and shared drink. The pub landlord, like the blacksmith and the shopkeeper, is a node in the village's information network. He hears everything, and his management of what he hears, to whom and when and how, is part of the social skill that makes a good pub landlord valued. The women of the village do not typically come to the pub in 1875, except occasionally and at specific hours. The pub is a male space in the way that the kitchen is a female space. Not absolutely, not by law, but by custom so consistent that it effectively functions as a norm. Women's socializing happens in kitchens, on doorsteps, at the church, in the social spaces of the village that are organized around the household and the community rather than around the commercial hospitality of the public house. This is not presented here as better or worse than the alternative. It is simply the social geography of the village, the way its spaces are organized and used, and it shapes the lives of everyone in it in ways that are so pervasive as to be nearly invisible to the people living inside them. 6 o'clock, the evening meal. The evening meal is tea, in the working-class cottage sense of tea. Not the ceremonial afternoon tea of the middle class, which is a different meal in a different tradition, but the practical evening meal of bread, and perhaps something cooked and strong sweet tea to drink, consumed at the table that is the kitchen table, the work surface, and the dining surface in one, by a family that has been distributed across the village's spaces all day and is now, briefly, in the same room. The quality of the evening meal is dependent on what the morning's shopping has yielded, what the kitchen garden has produced, what the pig has provided if the pig has been killed recently, and how the financial situation of the week stands. In good weeks, there is enough, and the eating is solid, if plain. In bad weeks, when the wage has gone partly toward a debt that has been accumulating, or when an illness has prevented work, or when a bad season has reduced the agricultural wages available, the eating is thinner, and the thinness is felt by everyone at the table in ways that do not need to be discussed. The children are at the table, the family is together. The day has been long, and tomorrow will be long too. And the evening's remaining hours, before the fire is banked and the family goes to bed, are the hours in which whatever social and domestic life is not organized around work happens. Reading, if anyone in the family can read with facility, and increasingly someone can, the spread of literacy through the village school means that the generation currently in school is substantially more literate than the generation that preceded it. A Bible is likely present in the cottage, because the Bible is the book most commonly given as a gift, the book most likely to be owned by a family that owns one book, and a family that owns one book may read that book with considerable regularity. Improving literature, the tracts and pamphlets produced by the religious and social reform organizations of the period, circulates through the village in small quantities, available through the church and the various voluntary organizations that distribute it. There may be singing. The Victorian period produced a culture of domestic music, the piano in the middle-class parlour, the singing in the working-class kitchen, the choir at the church, and the songs known and sung without accompaniment in the evenings by families around a fire represent a genuine thread of cultural life that runs through the period at every level of society. Music hall songs, hymns, the ballads and folk songs that have been circulating through the rural population for generations. These are the common cultural repertoire of the village, known by everyone, sung on occasions that warrant it and hummed on the ones that don't. 8 o'clock, the village at night. By 8 o'clock, the village is quieter but not silent. The pub is at its most active. The men who have gone home to eat and then returned, or the men who have come directly from work, or the farmer who has come in for an hour before bed, all contributing to the warmth and the noise of the main room. The children are in bed, or supposed to be. The Victorian insistence on early bedtimes for children was real, and in households where adults need to be up at 4 in the morning and children at 6, the practical argument for early bedtimes is strong. The darkness outside the pub and the church and the handful of households whose windows show light is genuine darkness. There are no street lights in this village in 1875. The moon, when it is present, provides real illumination. The specific silver grey of moonlit English countryside is genuinely sufficient for navigation, and the people who live here know their paths well enough to walk most of them in the dark. On moonless nights or overcast nights, the darkness is nearly complete, and movement outside after nightfall is done by lantern or by the intimate bodily knowledge of familiar ground. The sounds of the night are the village's animals, the occasional lowing of cattle in the barn, the dogs of various households doing their periodic announcements into the darkness, the owls that hunt the hedgerows. In spring, the frogs from the stream. In summer, the bats in the church tower. The soundscape of the village at night is the soundscape of a living agricultural landscape, not the engineered silence of a modern suburb or the constant ambient noise of a modern city, but something in between, quiet enough that individual sounds register, varied enough that they never produce the particular eeriness of total silence. 10 o'clock, the end of the day. By 10, the village is largely asleep. The fire in the cottage has been banked. The children have been asleep for 2 hours. The adults have been in bed for an hour, or close to it, because 4:30 comes quickly when you have been working since dawn. And the body that has been working since dawn does not need to be persuaded to rest when the opportunity comes. Sleep in this cottage is different from modern sleep in ways that are worth noting. The sleep of people without artificial light, without the blue light stimulation of screens, without the late evening activities that modern life provides. This sleep falls in a pattern that is different from the single consolidated sleep that most modern people experience. Historical evidence suggests that before artificial lighting became dominant, people slept in 2 periods with a waking interval in between. A first sleep from early evening, a waking period of an hour or 2 in the middle of the night in which one might pray or talk quietly with a spouse or attend to small tasks by candlelight, and then a second sleep that lasted until dawn. Whether this specific pattern is what you experience in this cottage on this night in 1875 depends on the individual, the season, and the specific demands of the day. But the night is longer than modern lives make room for, and the relationship between night and rest is more intimate and more total than anything most modern people experience. Outside the cottage, the village lies in the darkness. The fields that have been worked all day are empty. The church stands as it has stood for 600 years, its tower against the sky. The pub is dark, the landlord's chimney still faintly smoking. The school is empty, the slates wiped clean, ready for tomorrow. The blacksmith's forge is cold for the few hours that it is ever cold. The lane is empty in the moonlight, if there is moonlight, and full of a different kind of empty, if there is not. And the village sleeps. What the day leaves behind one day. One day in one English village in one year that is both ordinary and extraordinary, because it is the year it is. Caught between an agricultural world that has been operating in recognizable form for centuries and an industrial world that is reshaping everything. Caught between the church's authority and the spreading reach of secular education. Caught between the custom of centuries and the new organizations. The union, the board school, the friendly society, the mechanics institute, that are providing new frameworks for people who have always lived inside frameworks they did not choose. The village of 1875 is not the village of 1845, and it will not be the village of 1905. It is in motion, as everything is in motion, as everything has always been in motion, and the day we've spent in it is a day in the middle of a transition so large that the people living through it cannot fully see its shape, because you can never fully see the shape of the transition you are living through. What they can see is today, the bread on the table and the fire in the grate and the children on their way to a school that didn't exist when their parents were children. The farmer on his horse in the field, and the labourer walking behind the plough, and the school teacher writing on the chalkboard, and the blacksmith at his fire, and the women in the kitchen, and the men in the pub, and the vicar at his morning prayers. They can see the specific quality of light that comes in through a small window onto a stone floor on a morning in April. They can feel the cold at 4:30 in the morning, and the warmth of the fire once it catches, and the weight of the fatigue at the end of a working day that has used the body completely. They can hear the sounds, the hammer on the anvil, the children reciting in the schoolroom, The slow, rhythmic creak of the cart on the lane, the pub at its evening fullness, the silence afterward. This is what the day leaves behind. Not the big history, not the agricultural depression that is coming, or the political changes that are building, or the technological transformations that will remake this landscape within a generation. Just the day, just what it felt like to be alive in this place, in this body, doing this work, with these people, on this particular morning in the spring of 1875. The particular morning that nobody wrote about, because it was ordinary, which is, of course, exactly why it matters. If you watch this far, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.